There is a chemist in a lab in Nova Scotia named Nicoletta Faraoni, and a few years ago her team made a discovery about the black-legged tick that still surprises people when I mention it at dinner. The tick has no eyes. Not weak eyes, not a few basic light sensors tucked somewhere on its body. None at all. It cannot see you coming, it cannot see the grass, it cannot see anything. Instead, it hunts almost entirely by smell, reading the carbon dioxide on your breath from several feet away and the faint acids on your skin once you get close. So her team asked a question that sounds almost too simple. What if you could scramble that sense before the tick ever found you in the first place? What if the thing standing between you and a tick bite was not a spray you have to remember to reapply, but something already rooted in the yard? It turns out the answer has been sitting in ordinary gardens the whole time. Not one plant. Not 7. 10 of them, each working through its own chemistry, and by the end of this video you will know exactly which ones, where to put them, and just as important, how people get them wrong. If you like walking the garden with me, go ahead and hit subscribe, it genuinely helps this channel more than you would think. And while you are down there, tell me in the comments where you are watching from today. I like seeing how far this stuff travels. Alright. Let us start with plant number 1. Plant 1, lavender. Picture the Valençol Plateau in the south of France in the middle of July, purple running to the horizon in every direction. The plant's name comes from an old Latin word meaning to wash, because the Romans used to throw handfuls of it into public bathhouses. Roman soldiers carried it to dress wounds on the march. A Greek physician named Dioscorides wrote about its uses under the Emperor Nero, and nearly 1,000 years after that, a nun named Hildegard of Bingen was still prescribing it in her convent. The women who scrubbed the town's laundry in Old Provence were even called the lavandières, and the name of the job, the name of the plant, and the fields themselves all trace back to the same root word. Here is the part that matters for your yard. Lavender packs a compound called linalool into tiny structures on its leaves, along with a related compound called linalool acetate, together making up somewhere between 30 and 50% of the plant's oil. In laboratory testing, a 5% lavender oil solution caused over 80% of tick nymphs to become paralyzed within just 90 minutes. To a tick, it is not a smell it dislikes, it is closer to a chemical fog that shuts its whole sensory system down. But here is where people get it wrong. A lavender bush sitting quietly by the porch is not pumping out a protective cloud 24 hours a day. That oil needs to be released, which means the plant needs to be brushed against, or crushed, or walked past close enough to disturb the leaves. Planting it along a path where ankles and sleeves actually touch it matters far more than planting a lot of it somewhere decorative but untouched. If you want it to thrive, give it full sun, 6 to 8 hours a day, and lean, sandy soil with sharp drainage. This is one plant where kindness kills it. Rich compost and frequent watering rot the roots fast. Look for cultivars called Munstead or Hidcote, since they carry denser oil than the softer French or Spanish varieties. One caution worth knowing, lavender is toxic to cats and dogs, since cats in particular cannot safely process linalool, so keep that in mind if pets roam that part of the yard. Plant 2, rosemary. The old Latin name for rosemary means dew of the sea, because the plant naturally grows along dry, salt-sprayed cliffs where almost nothing else survives. In Hamlet, Ophelia hands out a sprig of it with a line about remembrance, and that association stuck so well that people in Australia and New Zealand still pin rosemary to their coats every year on Anzac Day, since it grows wild across the old battlefields at Gallipoli. There is even a story from the 1300s about a Hungarian queen restored to health by a rosemary tonic steeped in wine, a recipe that eventually became one of the first perfumes in Europe. The working chemistry here comes from camphor, a compound called alpha-pinene, and a crisp, sharp compound called cineol, all part of what gives rosemary its unmistakable piney scent. Alpha-pinene in particular interferes directly with the signaling system a tick relies on to hunt. And because these oils are relatively stable, they do not evaporate away quickly in summer heat the way lighter, more floral scents do, so the protection holds up through a hot afternoon. The mistake people make with rosemary is treating it like a normal garden plant that wants rich soil and regular watering. Do that and it rots at the base almost every time. It actually wants the opposite: dry conditions and light stress, which if anything raises the concentration of camphor in its oils. Give it full sun and sandy, low-nutrient soil with excellent drainage. A trailing variety planted along stone steps or a low wall works especially well, since every brush of a hand or pant leg releases the scent right where people are walking. Rosemary is also one of the few plants on this list that is non-toxic to both dogs and cats, which makes it an easy, low-risk choice near a play area or a dog run. Plant 3. Lemongrass. This next one brings us right back to that lab in Nova Scotia, because lemongrass is the plant behind the discovery that opened this video. Researchers there used a technique called electroscutimography, which lets them record a tick's nerve activity in real time, and then expose the ticks to lemongrass oil while watching what happened. The results were striking. Lemongrass oil is rich in a compound called citral along with something called beta-citronellol, and in the study it did not just annoy the tick's senses, it blocked the tick's nerve response to butyric acid almost entirely. Butyric acid is the chemical signature in human sweat that a tick uses to zero in on a host. In other words, this plant does not repel a tick so much as it blinds it. Where people go wrong with lemongrass is expecting a single thin stalk to do anything at all. It will not. The plant needs to grow into a real, established clump, at least 6 to 10 inches wide and roughly 2 feet tall, before it starts functioning as any kind of barrier. And fallen blades need to be cleared away from the base regularly, since a buildup of dead leaf litter traps humid air right at ground level, which ironically is exactly the kind of microclimate that helps ticks survive. Lemongrass is tropical, only reliably hardy in zones 9 through 11, so anyone in a cooler climate should plan on growing it in a large container and bringing it indoors for winter. It wants rich, consistently moist, nitrogen-heavy soil to grow fast. One note for pet owners: it can cause stomach upset in cats and dogs if ingested, so keep it out of reach if your animals like to nibble. Plant 4. Wormwood. This silvery, bitter herb has a stranger history than most people expect. It is the plant behind absinthe, the drink known as the Green Fairy that filled the cafes of Paris before it was banned across much of Europe for the better part of a century. The name even shows up in the Book of Revelation, where a falling star called wormwood turns the water bitter. Long before any of that drama, ordinary households were simply drying the leaves and tucking them among stored clothing to keep moths away. The chemistry splits into two jobs. Absinthin is responsible for that intense bitterness, and thujone acts directly on the nervous system of insects while also driving away larger browsing animals through taste and smell alone. And that second part is really the point. Wormwood's biggest value in a yard is not that it kills ticks on contact, it is that deer will not go near it, and deer are the ones carrying adult ticks onto a property in the first place. Think of it less as an insecticide and more as a closed gate. Wormwood wants lean, dry, sandy soil and full sun, and just like rosemary, rich compost and generous watering only make it flop over and rot. Plant it along the outer edge of the property, especially across any gaps in a fence line or tree break where deer tend to slip through. One serious caution here: wormwood is toxic if eaten and highly toxic to both dogs and cats, so wear gloves when trimming it and keep it well away from vegetable beds and pet areas. It can also spread on its own and is considered invasive in some northern states, so keep an eye on it. Plant 5. Chrysanthemums. Dried chrysanthemum flowers gave the world one of its oldest insecticides. There are records of people in China grinding the petals into bug powder as far back as the 1st century, and the practice eventually traveled west along the Silk Road. By the 1800s, the powder was being sold commercially out of Armenia, used to delouse children by the thousands, and French soldiers carried the same treatment against fleas during the Napoleonic Wars. Around 1840, growers in the region of Dalmatia found an even more potent relative of the flower, and today that same daisy is still cultivated at high elevation across Kenya and Tanzania. The active ingredients are a family of compounds called pyrethrins, and they work by jamming the sodium channels inside a tick's nervous system, causing repeated, uncontrolled firing that leads to paralysis and death. But it only works on contact. That is exactly where the common misunderstanding comes in. A chrysanthemum sitting quietly next to the deck is not gassing the whole yard with poison. The protection sits right at the flower head, and it fades quickly, with a half-life of roughly half a day once exposed to sunlight. Think of it as a landing strip, not a force field. To use it well, cluster the plants exactly where a tick would have to physically cross to reach you, along deck steps, the edge of the lawn, or near a woodpile. Pinch back the growing tips through early summer to encourage denser blooms. One important caution: the same compound that kills ticks is hard on bees, so keep the flowers away from areas where pollinators are actively working around midday, and make sure pets are not chewing on them either. Plant 6. Marigolds. The Aztecs were growing marigolds for roughly 3,000 years before Spanish soldiers under Hernán Cortés ever laid eyes on the flower-filled canals of Tenochtitlan. They called the plant the flower of 20 petals and scattered the blooms to help guide the spirits of the dead back home each year. Much later, the tall African variety became a farmyard staple for an entirely different reason, since the pigment in its petals was fed to hens to deepen the color of their egg yolks. Chemically, marigold leaves carry a family of compounds called thiophene along with trace terpenes, and below the surface the roots release a compound that is genuinely lethal to soil-dwelling nematodes, the microscopic worms that damage vegetable crops. Here is the honest myth bust, and it is a big one. Marigolds have a reputation as a strong tick repellent, but that reputation runs well ahead of the actual evidence. They are a real weapon against nematodes underground, but their effect on ticks in the air is mild at best. It gets worse if they are planted the wrong way. Pack them into a dense, shaded border and the thick foliage traps moisture right at soil level, which can actually create the damp little microclimate ticks like, and that same shade can draw in the small rodents that carry ticks around a property in the first place. The right way to use marigolds is sparse and sun-drenched, as edging or an accent planting, never as a solid wall of foliage. They are forgiving almost everywhere, growing from Zone 2 through Zone 11, and just need full sun and decent drainage. For the nematode benefit specifically, plant them about 2 months before the vegetables you want protected, in that same patch of soil. Plant 7. Garlic. The Greek historian Herodotus once wrote that the walls of the Great Pyramid recorded the exact amount of garlic and onion fed to the laborers who built it. Egyptians called garlic the plant of immortality, tucked whole cloves into the tombs of pharaohs, and archaeologists have found clay models of garlic bulbs in graves more than 5,000 years old. Jump forward to the Second World War. When penicillin ran short on the front lines, British and Russian field doctors packed raw garlic directly into open wounds to hold off infection, and it worked well enough to become standard practice for a time. The chemistry starts the moment a clove is damaged. Cutting or crushing it triggers an enzyme that produces a compound called allicin, which is the source of garlic's sharp smell, and allicin quickly breaks down further into sulfur compounds that disrupt a tick's sensory system. Here is the catch. A whole garlic bulb sitting quietly underground releases almost none of that compound into the air, so simply planting garlic and walking away will not do much for your ankles. The strongest evidence actually comes from a different direction entirely. In cattle trials, animals fed garlic and their mineral mix showed fewer ticks, performing about as well as chemical treatments. And in a randomized trial involving Swedish soldiers, the group taking around 1,200 milligrams of garlic extract a day saw roughly 30% fewer tick bites than the group given a placebo. The real lesson is that garlic earns its keep either eaten regularly or crushed into a topical spray, not simply left in the ground. If you do want to grow it, plant the cloves in autumn rather than spring, so the roots can establish through the cold months before green shoots appear. It tolerates serious cold, wants full sun and loose, well-drained soil, and tucks in nicely among roses or vegetable beds. One firm caution: garlic is highly toxic to dogs and cats, so keep any bed of it well out of reach of pets. Plant 8. Sage. Sage carries its old reputation right in its name. The word traces back to a Latin root meaning to heal or to save, and for centuries it was one of the first herbs any household would plant, valued for medicine nearly as much as for cooking. Like wormwood, sage contains both thujone and camphor, and that same bitter, sharp combination is exactly the kind of scent deer and rabbits instinctively avoid. The honest note here is that sage is not a standout tick killer by itself. Its real strength is as a browsing deterrent, working alongside plants like wormwood rather than replacing them. Treat it as a stand-alone shield and it will disappoint you, but treat it as one layer in a broader planting and it earns its place. Give it full sun, lean and dry sandy soil, and go easy on the fertilizer, since rich feeding actually softens the very oils that make sage useful. Plant it in the transition areas of the yard, the spots where deer and rabbits would otherwise pass through freely. It is non-toxic to pets, which makes it one of the easier, lower-risk choices on this whole list if you have children or animals running around that part of the garden. Plant 9 Peppermint. Peppermint earns a warning before it even earns credit for repelling anything. Its roots behave like an advancing army, sending runners underground in every direction until the plant has quietly taken over an entire bed. Almost anyone who has grown it in open soil has a story about finding it somewhere it was never planted. The working compound is menthol, and it interferes with a signaling chemical that ticks and many other insects rely on, causing something close to a spasm in a tick that comes into contact with it. The mistake is planting it straight into open ground and expecting a tidy little patch to stay put. It will not. The exact trait that makes peppermint so aggressive is the same trait that makes it hard to manage as a controlled barrier. The fix is simple. Grow it strictly in a sealed container with no drainage into the surrounding soil, and set that container right next to a doorway or a seating area, where a light brush against the leaves releases the scent exactly where people are sitting. It does well in partial shade to full sun with consistently moist soil, and it is safe to have around pets. Plant 10. American Beautyberry. The last plant on this list has a quieter, more recent story than the others. Researchers at the United States Department of Agriculture were led to this shrub by a piece of folk knowledge passed down through farming families across the American South, who used to crush its leaves and tuck them under the harnesses of their mules and horses to keep biting insects off the animals during long, hot days of field work. Government scientists eventually isolated the compounds responsible for that effect, named calicarpinol and intermediol, and tested them using a bioassay where ticks are made to climb a treated strip of cloth. At a specific concentration, the extract repelled 98% of black-legged tick nymphs for a full 3 hours, matching the performance of DEET, though it worked noticeably less well against the lone star tick. The catch is that this striking number came from a concentrated leaf extract in a lab, not simply from standing near the bush. As a living plant in your yard, the practical use mirrors that old farming trick almost exactly, crushing a handful of leaves and applying them directly to skin or clothing, rather than expecting the shrub itself to clear the yard on its own. American Beautyberry grows well anywhere from partial shade to full sun and adapts to a wide range of soils, which makes it a solid native choice for a woodland edge or a wildlife-friendly border. Unlike several plants on this list, it is non-toxic to pets, so it is safe to plant generously and harvest from by hand whenever you need it. We are halfway past the finish line now, and if even one of these 10 has surprised you, that is exactly why I make videos like this. If you have not subscribed yet, now is a good time, and stick with me, because there is one more idea worth understanding before we wrap up. Here is the thing none of these 10 plants can do alone. Not one of them is a force field. Every single one on this list only works when it is placed with intention, tended the right way, and in several cases, actually crushed or brushed or eaten rather than simply left standing in the ground looking pretty. There is a number worth sitting with here. In parts of Connecticut, researchers found that dense, overgrown woodland thickets held about 120 infected ticks per acre. Cleared, open ground nearby, just a short walk away, held only about 10. That is not a small difference. That is the difference between a yard that quietly hosts a health risk and a yard that simply does not. So this was never really about memorizing 10 plant names. It is about understanding what kind of habitat your yard actually offers. Make it dry, sunny, and inhospitable in the right places. Layer these plants where they will actually do their job, and the ticks that would have moved in largely never get the chance. If this helped you look at your yard a little differently, go ahead and subscribe so you do not miss the next one, and let me know in the comments which of these 10 you are